The legacy of 20th century socialism is filled with controversy and misconceptions, as most of the information we have on these countries is shrouded in mystery and rarely ever presented in a positive light. Most of anything you've likely ever heard about any nominally socialist state likely came from an uncompromisingly anti-communist source, which paints them with many labels that you've likely already heard 1,000 times. And they do this while omitting many crucial facts that, if acknowledged, would render their rabidly anti-communist stance utterly ridiculous and disingenuous. All such misconceptions have been refuted plenty of times by both myself and other people out there, so those won't be the focus of this video, but feel free to take a look if you're interested. Nonetheless, the goal of this one is to present to you the other side of the story, the socialist legacy of the Eastern Bloc, told through statistics, economic indicators, scientific and sociological studies, and research that points to an entirely opposite direction in evaluating its historical footprint in Eastern Europe. Proof, if you will, that not only dismantles the narrative of how socialism is a dystopian tyrannical system that quote-unquote never worked, and which only brings poverty and suffering to its people, but shows us how the communist revolution has actually had an unfathomable amount of successes and achievements across all metrics of progress and human welfare, in spite of all obvious mistakes and shortcomings. And suddenly, with such a fresh, new perspective, future prospects of radical change and transcending capitalism suddenly don't seem as much of a lost cause as we're all led to believe. And as you'll see for yourself, exploring every single aspect of their success would take a whole Netflix series to do it justice, but for now, this short rundown will have to do. But if this were to become a Netflix series, we all know how that would go. Some of you simply wouldn't be able to watch it because of your location, just like all of the other epic shows and movies that you're probably missing out on. But don't worry, Surfshark VPN, the sponsor of today's video, has a solution for you. Surfshark not only allows you to safely browse the internet by protecting your privacy and hiding your IP address, but also helps you to bypass all of Netflix's geo restrictions and watch content that may be otherwise unavailable in your country. And if there's something that sounds even better than bypassing restrictions, then that's changing your device's location and getting cheaper prices for plane tickets, hotel rooms, online stores, subscription services, you name it. And if that wasn't enough, you'll also get their extra subscription pack, Surfshark One, which has even more awesome features like Surfshark Alert, which helps you stay informed about who might be using and stealing your online data in real time. So make sure to grab their special offer and protect your privacy with Surfshark VPN, with 4 months of free access with the code BALKANODYSSEY and the link in the description. And don't let predatory pricing or geo restrictions prevent you from enjoying the things you like. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring, and now back to the video. So, let's begin by setting up the context in which the revolution happened in the first place. This will give us some orientation and somewhat of a metric on what to consider as a success, which is of course a relative term and depends on what you started up with. So that being said, before socialism, Central Europe to a slightly lesser and Eastern and Southeastern Europe to a much greater extent used to be backward, underdeveloped, piss-poor societies which had continuously been under the boot of a mixture of Austro-Hungarian, German, Ottoman, and Russian imperial conquest and exploitation, and altogether fully comparable to the middle-level underdeveloped countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America today. While Western Europe was busy industrializing, developing, and rapidly transitioning towards capitalism, with the wealth accrued through centuries of colonial plunder across the blood-soaked global south, these few key players were fighting for supremacy over the eastern side of the continent. Their yoke was mostly feudal in nature, with constant brutal wars, exploitation of natural resources and peasant labor, ridiculous feudal taxes, ethnic and religious repression, and overall neglect of the people who lived under their boot. The primitive levels of capital that were forming these overwhelmingly rural, agrarian, feudal, and backward societies all flow towards the few economic powerhouses in Vienna, Berlin, and other Western capitals, and to a lesser extent, Moscow and Istanbul. Moreover, Eastern Europe had a majority peasant population, with the almost non-existent industrial base in the hands of their imperial overlords, and whose basic, low-level production was oriented towards satisfying their predatory ambitions. Their agrarian character was intentionally perpetuated with the goal of keeping them as appendages of Western economies. Accordingly, local infrastructure like roads and railways existed solely to satisfy the needs of extracting these resources towards the imperial core. Urban centers were small and sparse. The overwhelming majority of people were illiterate, with very basic or no education, with no developed linguistic or literary basis, unsolved national questions, weak cultural institutions, etc. Moreover, these were highly patriarchal societies with the most primitive attitudes towards women and their rights. Access to any form of healthcare, sanitation, and basic utilities was available only to a tiny layer of people on the top, while workers and peasants were contending with raging epidemics, horrendous child mortality rates, malnutrition, and life expectancy straight from medieval times. Political and workers' rights were de facto non-existent, as the combination of dictatorial monarchic regimes and early unregulated capitalist industry manifested in complete political domination of the ruling class. In turn, this meant the brutal crackdown on all communist organizations and parties who aimed to offer any alternative, through mass arrests, incarcerations, tortures, and murders. So if you weren't a serf toiling away in some godforsaken village, then you were a wage laborer, working for 12 hours straight in a coal mine or some factory next to your 10-year-old child with no safety regulations, no breaks, no paid vacation, sick leave, maternity leave, whatsoever. You were, colloquially speaking, a slave, through and through. Of course, the local comprador elites, the highly dependent ruling stratum of these countries, were the ones who allowed for such an arrangement, with their complacence and inability to resist the occupying forces. And we can go on for hours about how terrible the socioeconomic situation was the more you went towards the east. But this brief summary should give you a clear enough picture of how pathetic the material basis was that the revolutionary governments of the 20th century inherited in their respective countries. So, with such inhumane treatment of the vast majority of people, the monarcho-capitalist system was creating the conditions for its own downfall. Its unbearable contradictions had essentially forced the masses of workers to organize themselves and fight for their rights. In the midst of the First and then the Second World Wars, successful communist revolutions erupted in Tsarist Russia and then Yugoslavia and Albania, primarily as reactions and acts of liberation against the onslaught of imperialism and fascism and their destructive effects on the working class on all sides of the barricade. Upon the defeat of Nazi Germany, Red Army troops marched into all Eastern European capitals and with the help of local resistance organizations formed revolutionary governments. If not with the failure of the communist revolution in Western Europe by the 1920s, then most definitely with the lowering of the Iron Curtain in 1945, all prospects of world revolution were officially squashed. Already by 1924, the success of the World Revolution as the precondition for the survival of the USSR was abandoned by Soviet officialdom. Thus, in the conditions of a final capitalist encirclement of the USSR, and after World War II the entire Eastern Bloc, the construction of socialism in one country had commenced. This ad hoc doctrine prompted each nation-state to quote-unquote construct socialism in their own backyard, often dogmatically following the example of the USSR as the quote-unquote cradle of socialism, which led to many deformations and grave mistakes. Now, these complex circumstances, riddled with unsolvable contradictions that we'll explore some other time, set the context for the construction of socialism in Eastern Europe. From here stem all of the positive achievements of actually existing socialism that we're going to be exploring in this video. All of the defects, deformations, mistakes, shortcomings, and crimes of Stalinism, whose implications have shaped the popular perception of socialism and revolutionary change more broadly, will be analyzed in detail in an upcoming video. We're talking forced collectivization, famines, the availability of consumer goods, policies regarding religion and sexuality, deportation of suspect nationalities, the ossification of leadership, social stratification and corruption due to careerism and bureaucracy, the shortcomings and abuses of bureaucratic decision-making, the rigidness and shortcomings of central planning, political dogmatism and the purges, party monolithism and repression, a limited flow of information and people, foreign policy towards other socialist states, and many, many other factors of the economic decline from the 1980s onwards. So keep in mind that I'm very aware of all of the concerns that you might have, and am, as many other comrades, more brutally critical towards all their problems than you might think. Now, having that said, there are still many things that you may have heard and have been told that are likely to be over-exaggerated, misrepresented, or taken out of context. I've already done a couple of video essays refuting the most prevalent misconceptions about communism, so make sure to check them out. But altogether, just try to keep an open mind and have some patience until that video is done. For the time being, let's give that system the benefit of the doubt and take a look at everything that actually went well. And trust me, there's more than you think. So, before we come to the actual achievements, let's take a brief look at their backbone, the socio-economic upheavals that occurred in these countries in the process of building socialism. Keep in mind that all of this occurred in the context of a completely decimated economy, infrastructure, productive capacities, and unfathomable loss of human life in World War II, and perhaps even more importantly, isolation from the rest of the world economy. Opposed to Western European countries, which were resurrected with US loans and aid through the Marshall Plan, and millions of Third World guest workers, the completely autonomous revival of the Eastern Bloc included the nationalization of the means of production, meaning the expropriation of factories, estates, enterprises, and machinery from the former ruling class, often comprised of foreigners and occupiers, and their appropriation by the worker state. As a result, during this period, the classes that were most affluent and influential before the war, that is, the large landowners and the bourgeoisie, were eliminated. These productive forces were then put to use through a centrally planned economy with top-down administrative allocation of labor and resources, and fulfillment of long-term goals through so-called 5-year plans. These were then implemented via a similar blueprint across all Eastern Bloc states. Analysis shows that the sources of the major economic achievements of the 1950s were the following. The command economy in this period demonstrated its viability and macroeconomic efficiency. The Soviet economy, being in essence the largest corporation in the world, made skillful use of the strengths of any large corporation, preparing and implementing long-term plans, using colossal financial resources for development in priority directions, carrying out major capital investments in a short period of time, spending large sums on scientific research, and so on. But more on that later. In an attempt to quote-unquote solve the agrarian question and more effectively feed the skyrocketing urban population, the controversial forced collectivization of small peasant holdings into large collective farms took place. The extent to which this worked and failed is again a topic for another time. Nonetheless, the precondition for building a modern socialist society was having a strong industry, and above all, heavy industry. Since most Eastern European revolutionary states either inherited an almost non-existent industrial base, like most of the Balkans, or had theirs completely destroyed in World War II, like Poland and Russia, they had to build one from scratch, quickly. The rapid industrialization and electrification of the country was therefore the most prominent feature and first step in building socialism. It lifted millions of people out of abject poverty and directed millions more from backward rural villages into the newly developing cities. As Joseph Stalin is often quoted saying, "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us." Thus, Soviet industrial production grew by an average of 11% per year from 1928 to 1940, and doubled between 1929 and 33, in the worst years of the Great Depression. In the Turkmen SSR from 1913 to 1978, industrial output increased by 74 times. In Tajik SSR by 138 times, in Kyrgyz SSR by 333 times, by 71 times in Uzbek SSR, by 232 times in Kazakh SSR, and by 62 times in Azerbaijan SSR. This compares with an increase of 151 times in the Russian Republic since 1913. More on the context, extent, and success of Soviet industrialization in Robert C. Allen's book, Farm to Factory. So now, the challenge of adequately housing this rapidly increasing urban population of the growing working class was, despite many difficulties, solved impressively well. The Soviet Union undertook one of the most massive centrally controlled and planned policies for human and industrial resettlement in history. Since 1926, the Soviet government had built more than 1,400 new towns in which more than 50 million people live, work, and play. During the first 5-year plans, it reached the highest urban concentration rate ever recorded before World War II in any major country. As I've already analyzed in great detail in the recent video about commie blocks, socialist urban planning across the entire Eastern Bloc helped house millions of homeless and solved the burning housing issue that the feudalist and bourgeois orders were unwilling and unable to address. For more insight into the incredible achievement which was socialist urban planning, make sure to check out that video. Nonetheless, these colossal processes led to huge changes in the social class structure of these countries, with the proletarization of the majority peasant population, eradication of the unemployed lumpen proletariat, eradication of the bourgeoisie and landowning aristocracy, re-establishment of the decimated intelligentsia, and immense growth of the working class. So now, we come to the actual achievements of socialism across all socioeconomic spheres. We'll take a very brief look at each one of them, while citing plenty of sources that you can look into. If you'd like to see more detailed videos on each of them in the future, let me know in the comments and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. So, let's begin with the economy. The socialist industrial revolution and rapid accumulation of capital was the key to these countries' outstanding economic growth. The Soviet growth rate of capital doubled its size every 8 to 9 years, which is almost without precedent in human history. Even if we use GDP per capita, a very flawed way to measure economic growth and its impact on human life, and which favors market economies opposed to planned ones that don't rely on monetary and commodity exchange to get things done, before 1977, the Soviet economy was one of the most successful in the world. However, the right comparison group for assessing Soviet performance is not the United States, despite the enthusiasm of both communists and Americans for that comparison, but rather other countries with a similar level of income in 1928. The USSR outperformed all of those countries except Japan. Nonetheless, the Soviet Union has been closing the gap with the US and other countries from the West. From about 1/4 of the size of the US economy in 1928, the Soviet economy climbed to about 40% in 1955, 50% in 1965, and about 60% in 1977. Moreover, Yugoslavia, with its hybrid model, showed remarkable economic growth. It was the fastest growing socialist economy in the post-World War II era. Other Eastern European planned economies like Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary also showed exceptional growth rates compared to capitalist economies of comparable levels of development. In fact, the average rate of growth in per capita net material product in the 6 Comecon countries of Eastern Europe in the 1960 to 73 period was almost double the rates of growth in the USA and the common market, the heartlands of advanced capitalism. Further, it was virtually identical to the rate of growth of the Soviet Union, the most mature of socialist economies. Eastern Europe's average rate of growth of industry in the same 1960 to 73 period also compares favorably with the rates for Latin America, that part of the Third World most comparable to Eastern Europe, and the USA, the common market, and the Soviet Union. The economic achievements of the 1950s were so significant that many Soviet economists and the overwhelming majority of Western economists working on the Soviet economy, as well as statesmen in Western countries, formed the impression towards the end of the 1950s that the USSR economy would inevitably overtake the USA in the future. The differences were only about when this would happen. In the 1970s, as the Soviet leadership assumed, or the 1980s or 1990s, as Western economists reckoned. What's more, this growth was unusually stable and steady compared to the capitalist world, which went through harsh recessions and crises every decade or so. Such extreme financial and economic stability was ensured not only by a sharp increase in the efficiency of production, but also by skillful management of the monetary, credit, and financial sphere, and the high level of effectiveness of these spheres in delivering monetary and financial stability with very high, which must be emphasized, absolute and relative growth rates of the budget and credit-financed investment in the economy. None of this is, of course, to say that there were no inefficiencies, abuses, shortages, etc. But once again, topic for another time. In the meantime, regarding this and the obvious decline and eventual collapse from the 1970s onwards, here's a few sources for further reading. However, as we all know, the growth and size of the economy and the line going up are by no means useful indicators of actual quality of life, happiness, and welfare. In fact, many of the best parts of socialist progress can't even be reflected through vulgar economics. Truth be told, nobody should have illusions about the first few decades of socialist construction. Many sacrifices had to be made in terms of consumption and the standard of living to kickstart the lagging industry from absolute rock bottom, especially after the inferno which was World War II. However, the rapid pace of economic development in the USSR brought about a significant improvement in the standard of living from the 1950s onwards. Over the entire 1940 to 1980 period, the real wages of Soviet factory and office workers increased by a factor of 3.7 times. The level of consumption of basic and high-quality goods like meat, milk, sugar, etc. rose by almost 200% and came to the level of a number of advanced countries. Per capita consumption of more luxurious clothing, more advanced consumer goods like TVs and fridges, and the sales of cultural and domestic goods also rose by more than 200%. Housing and transport in the USSR are also heavily subsidized. The standard fare in the Soviet subway is 5 kopecks, about 8 cents, a fare that has remained unchanged since the 1930s. Housing, medicine, transport, and insurance account for an average of 15% of a Soviet family's income, compared to 50% in the US, while such services as higher education and childcare are either free or heavily subsidized. Rent took up only 2 or 3%, and utilities only 4 or 5% of a family's income. In East Germany, rent took up less than 10% of total income, and evictions were illegal. In 1964, personal consumption per capita in the German Democratic Republic was 156% that of the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia was 150%, Hungary 117%, Poland 103%, Bulgaria 100%, and Romania 86%. In general, the level of economic development and the standard of living are both generally higher in most of the Comecon countries of Eastern Europe than they are in the Soviet Union. Though Soviet per capita consumption remained lower than in the US, no society had ever increased living standards and consumption so rapidly in such a short period of time for all of its people. So, without exaggeration, it can be said that, from the point of view of the population's standard of living, a new country appeared during the course of the 1950s, free from grinding poverty, and by world standards, secure, although not rich, for the majority of its citizens. A 1988 study by 2 American university professors compared socialist and capitalist countries across different indicators of the physical quality of life. The analysis of health conditions of populations continent by continent shows that, contrary to dominant ideology, socialism and socialist forces have, for the most part, been better able than capitalism and capitalist forces to improve health conditions. In the underdeveloped world, socialist forces and regimes have, more frequently than not, made greater improvements in health and social indicators than have the capitalist forces and regimes. In the developed world, countries with strong socialist forces have been able to improve health conditions better than those countries without or with weak socialist forces. Within each level of economic development, the socialist forces had infant mortality and child death rates approximately 2 times lower than the capitalist countries. Similar, though less striking relationships emerged for life expectancy. Socialist countries consistently showed higher numbers of health professionals per population than capitalist countries at equivalent levels of economic development. For example, the GDR had 24 doctors per 10,000 people by 1989, higher than the USA or UK. Although obviously not a European country, in 2018, Cuba had 8.4 doctors per 1,000 people, a remarkable statistic. Moreover, socialist countries provided a higher daily per capita calorie supply as a percentage of requirement than did the capitalist countries at a similar level of development. The difference between capitalist and socialist countries averaged 12 to 15%. Nutritional supply of all socialist countries exceeded the 100% requirement. Thus, malnutrition, which was still very widespread at the beginning of the 1950s, was practically eliminated. According to the 1913 Tsarist census, life expectancy among the population was 32.3 years. A concentrated expression of these and other measures to raise the standard of living, for example improvement of healthcare, was the enormous increase in life expectancy of the population of the Soviet Union to 69, the level of most developed countries in the world at that time. In Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland, life expectancy increased significantly, approaching or even surpassing Western European standards. In Romania, it jumped from 42 to 72 years. Saraceto and Waldskin, conclude their investigation by saying, "Our analysis of the World Bank's data supports a conclusion that, in the aggregate, the socialist countries have achieved more favorable physical quality of life outcomes than capitalist countries at equivalent levels of economic development." These astonishing achievements are explained by the simple fact that the share of expenditure on education, healthcare, and science in GDP in the USSR in this period, as is well known, was one of the highest in the world. Concretely, their expenditure on healthcare and physical education needs grew from 2.1 billion in 1950 to 4.8 billion in 1960. Universal, free access to basic health services was enshrined through the Soviet Constitution of 1937, whereby healthcare was guaranteed as a human right. Thus, many healthcare-related problems were solved very effectively. The socialist approach towards healthcare was, above all, preventative. Instead of acutely treating illnesses accrued to physiological and psychological neglect of an alienating society, and shoving people with ridiculously expensive medications marketed by dishonest pharmaceutical corporations, in most socialist states, working conditions, housing, nutrition, and education were all considered as health-related matters. They understood that the everyday well-being of every person will have an impact on health outcomes, so the reduction of uncertainty, stress, burnout, and other work-related problems went a long way in maintaining a healthy society.
Central to Marxism is the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the abolition of class society. With the abolition of class society would naturally come, one might assume, the abolition, or at least the heavy reduction, of income inequality. Did the Soviet Union achieve this? Well, the Soviet Union's biggest problems with fighting inequality came with declaring that issues like class were already resolved. This had its origins in the likes of Stalin, who proclaimed that classes in the USSR were abolished. By denying that these things existed anymore, it obviously became harder to fight them, given that they were apparently things that had been declared to not exist at all. However, it was undeniable that the Soviet Union was still extremely equal, especially compared to its recent Tsarist past, and after Stalin's death, where inequality had slightly gone up during his turbulent tenure as leader of the Soviet Union, inequality proceeded to rapidly go down. Jerry Howe writes of the sharp reduction that began after Stalin's death in the degree of inequality of incomes in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Peter Wiles, a professional comparative economist, or someone who specifically specializes in the study of comparing economies, wrote in 1974 that "I doubt if any other country can show a more rapid and sweeping progress towards equality." Recon cites Alistair Macaulay in his work, The Distribution of Earnings and Incomes in the Soviet Union. Some findings of his were that inequality, measured by the decile ratio, decreased by around 40% in the 1956-65 period, achieved by a faster increase of the earnings of the poor, 144%, compared to those of the richer citizens, 38%. As Macaulay writes, the USSR in the 1970s was substantially more equal than the UK, Italy, or the US, and roughly the same as the Eastern Bloc. One of the USSR's main failures in regards to fighting income inequality, despite its attempts to rectify the issue, were to reduce income inequality between its different republics. As the economist Jose Recon writes, the Soviet Union not only tried to equalize incomes across the USSR, but also in theory, between different republics. However, as he writes, little convergence has happened. This is in spite of economic growth, as the birth rates in the poorer republics outpaced it, increasing the denominator of per capita GDP. Despite this failing, the Baltic state had a higher average standard of living than the Russian SFSR, and while countries in Central Asia like Turkestan had comparatively low standards of living, none of the countries of the Soviet Union were particularly radically over or underdeveloped. to any extent even approaching the differences between the Western imperial core and periphery, or even semi-periphery. Recon cites Macaulay, who finds that Gini coefficient measurements of inequality were at 288 in the urban USSR from 1972-1974, lower than the average of both rural and urban areas of all industrialized first world countries other than Sweden, which had a coefficient of 254. Macaulay's data does show that there was an urban-rural divide, with more poor people living in rural areas, but this is a problem almost universal to basically all modern industrialized societies. By 1967-68, the decile ratio was around 3, meaning that the richest citizens, on average, were earning 3 times as much as the poorest ones, which seems quite equal. In comparison, the UK had a ratio of 3.4. As Rincon writes, citing Matthews, elites are considered by Matthews as those who earn at least 400-500 rubles a month, 3.1 to 3.8 times average 1972 pay of all Soviet wage earners and salaried workers. This makes up about 0.2% of all employees, and 1% at most if other sources of income are included. The top 1% at most made less than 4 times the pay of the average worker. Compared to modern social democracies today, such as the ideal model of social democracy, Norway, the second most advanced country in the world according to inequality-adjusted HDI, the Soviet Union had less income inequality. Compare this even to modern China, which, for all the good it's done in reducing and controlling the rich through various means, still has numerous billionaires, not to mention millionaires, something the Soviet Union never had at all. Finally, compilation of dozens of studies on economic inequality by the economist Mark Harrison finds, despite Harrison making the usual caveats, such as that the elites had access to higher quality services, that in its time the Soviet Union, in contrast to Western countries, was apparently one of the most equal countries in the world, despite its huge population of 288 million by 1991. Of course, the idea that the elites had access to services the average person didn't is what really mattered is alluded to by economists like Mark Harrison, and elites did have favoritism. They did have better prospects for success, access to better apartments, better food, and generally better consumer goods. And this was a problem that was never properly confronted, even though attempts were made at doing so. However, while they lived more comfortably than the average person, what they did not live as was as remotely privileged a life as the elites of capitalist societies. Ultimately, for all intents and purposes, despite its many problems, the Soviet system was one of, if not the most economically equal countries on Earth, and had great potential to be reformed to be even more equal, if not for its collapse instead.
By the 1960s, the Soviet Union had gone from being one of the most illiterate places on the planet to being, by some measures, one of the best educated. It turned out more graduates per head of population than any of the European countries. Only the American college system, with its tradition of mass participation, did better. In an unprecedentedly short space of time, less than 2 decades, and without any outside assistance, the world's first socialist state, the USSR, did away with age-old illiteracy, which had been as high as 75%, introduced universal elementary education, and was starting on the task of introducing universal secondary education. Other Eastern Bloc countries followed suit, and soon achieved literacy rates of 90 to 100%. The Soviet budget expenditure on education grew from 5.7 billion rubles in 1950 to 10.3 billion rubles in 1960. The Soviet constitution, in fact, guaranteed the right to free and professional education, including higher education, but also the right to use nurseries, kindergartens, and summer camps for free, and the right to free sanatorium and spa treatment. The Soviets' ideologically shaped solution to the extreme shortage of technical specialists in the 1930s included a dramatic explosion of public funding to education at all levels, the abolishment of tuition, along with all other fees of higher education, a radical increase in the number of specialized technical schools, and an unprecedented broadening of the demographic base of science and engineering students, with massive promotion of representatives of lower classes, women, and ethnic minorities. Even though education was free, the USSR introduced stipends to cover living and school expenses, which are provided for higher education students who maintain a B or higher average. The number of scientific research institutes in Russia, including experimental stations, publishing houses, libraries, and full-fledged centers of research activity, grew from 21 to 85, and perhaps to as many as 105 between 1918 and 1928. In the USSR, the number of schools quadrupled as 16,000 were built between 1933 and 38. In their attempts to democratize access to higher education, the Bolsheviks did not remain satisfied with merely annulling the formal discriminatory barriers of gender, ethnicity, and religion. They tried to compensate actively for economic disadvantages and earlier discrimination by adopting a system of preferential treatment for potential students from underrepresented groups: workers, peasants, women, and ethnic minorities, broader and more radical than the analogous one currently known in the United States as affirmative action. The measures included free tuition, quotas, and stipends for low-income students. Furthermore, cultural amenities such as theater, music, film, and literature were, compared to the past, thriving across all socialist countries. Before socialism, most people had never even seen movies or had access to a library. But now, the number of public libraries, worker clubs, operas, and cinemas dramatically increased. As a vivid example, in 1915, there were only around 52 cinemas in Central Asia. By the 1960s, this number increased to around 7,000. And even more impressively for a country that used to be predominantly illiterate in the very recent past, 3 of every 5 books in the world were produced in the Soviet Union. Communism, especially in its Soviet incarnation, happened to be one of the most favorably predisposed towards science, believing most utterly, up to the point of irrationality, in science's power and value. The Soviets were, unlike their predecessors, interested in supporting science and technology, and especially in establishing scientific research institutes. Initially, though, Eastern Bloc countries were compelled to close the waning technological gap with the West through the licensing of existing technologies or their acquisition through espionage. Once they managed to catch up, the very effective incentives to scientists and inventors provided by the Soviet patent system resulted in a yearly number of inventions similar to that of the USA. The high rate of scientific and technical progress in this period was ensured by an exceptionally high rate of growth of expenditure on science, although a considerable part of that was used for military purposes. Further evidence of rapid scientific and technical progress in this period was provided by such major events as the flight of the Soviet satellite Sputnik, the commissioning of an atomic power station, the first flight in the world by a supersonic passenger aircraft, and a number of other technical achievements in which the USSR outstripped the USA. There are many, many more inventions from the Soviet Union you likely never assumed were made under socialism, like the mobile phone itself. More on those in ChemicalMind's amazing video on the topic. Moreover, another astonishing achievement would be the utter domination of the USSR in the space race, with the first satellite, animal, person, and woman in space, the first spacewalk, first spacecraft landing on the moon, first spacecraft landing on another planet, Venus, the first space station, and the first spacecraft landing on Mars. So much for the lack of innovation under socialism. Whilst political dialogue was in many ways suffocated by the ruling communist parties and Stalin-era dogmatism led to plenty of unnecessary suffering, much of the USA government and mainstream press propaganda about political repression and secret police in Eastern Europe was exaggerated. The book Socialist Paradise or Stasi State expands on this point extremely well. Inflated, convoluted, and misrepresented figures of gulag incarcerations, executions, and famine deaths, which nonetheless existed, were the basis of anti-communist propaganda, personified through the Black Book of Communism, whose absurdity I've already critiqued in another video. Compared to the capitalist West and all their monarchist and fascist comprador regimes across the globe, to their bloody and ruthless annihilation of anti-capitalist dissidents at home and abroad, through CIA and NSA surveillance programs, death squads, coups, PSYOP programs like MKUltra, and other outright evil crackdowns on communists, even the most brutal Stalin, Hoxha, and Ceausescu eras start to look benign in comparison, and wouldn't even rank top 5 in any leaderboard regarding incarceration rates, executions, or levels of surveillance. As soon as we take a look at Albert Zumansky's works, Is the Red Flag Still Flying?, and Pat Sloan's Soviet Democracy, and similar books, it becomes apparent that Eastern Bloc countries, despite all obvious careerist and bureaucratic deformations, in fact offered many avenues for direct political participation through various institutions and state bodies, such as unions, syndicates, mass organizations, youth organizations, comrades courts, people's control commissions, people's police units, legislative bodies, etc. So guess what? It wasn't just Stalin or Tito calling the shots from the top on where you're allowed to take a dump today. In fact, observers otherwise hostile to the Soviet Union claim that the public debates, struggles, and criticisms are reaching deeper and deeper into the social structure as policymaking becomes more and more decentralized and the number of participants increases. There is considerable freedom of discussion, and there exist sharp differences of opinion on a wide range of issues. Basic policies are increasingly formulated, discussed, and challenged in public speeches, forums, and editorial statements in newspapers and periodicals. The only inviolable subjects that were not up to debate was the Communist Party as an institution, the existence of the military, socialism as a system and communism as an ideal, the idea of the unity of the party and the people, and the persons of the current top political leaders. Therefore, all debate happened within the broad assumptions of the existing system, which, as we can see, wasn't as terrible as you were led to believe. In fact, there seems to be virtual consensus among Western Sovietologists, most of whom are, of course, neither Marxists nor sympathizers of the Soviet regime, that there is a widespread support for the Soviet system among the people as a whole and the working people in particular. This conclusion is supported by various polls that we'll touch upon later. But if political rights left much to be desired for some, then the workers' rights were one colossal and undeniable achievement which even spread beyond the Iron Curtain and compelled the capitalist world to grant many concessions to their working class in fear of revolution. More on this fascinating effect of communism on the formation of Western welfare states in ChemicalMind's amazing video. Nonetheless, Zumansky's work, Human Rights in the Soviet Union, easily demonstrates how much of a significant improvement socialism brought to its citizens in terms of basic civil liberties, participatory rights, women's rights, workers' rights, and productive property rights, such as the right to work, housing, education, medicine, social security, etc., compared to the misery of pre-socialist life. Social mobility and opportunities for climbing the social ladder through education were higher than ever before. Following the establishment of the USSR, the right to an 8-hour workday, the right to annual paid leave, and the right to 3-year maternity leave were guaranteed to all citizens. All able-bodied men were legally required to have a job, which resulted in virtually zero unemployment. Moreover, Eastern Bloc countries had an extremely low retirement age. In the USSR, it was only 55 for women and 60 for men. At the workplace itself, with the institution of workers' councils and with the granting of political and economic rights to labor unions, the workers became co-managers of industrial plants. The participation of the workers in the formation of the power system was very great during this period. In Yugoslavia, companies were essentially worker-led cooperatives that exercised a large degree of self-management. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was followed by a radical transformation in the legal and economic position of women. Marriage and divorce became matters of mutual consent affected by simple registration. Divorce could be initiated by either party, and marriage became a formally egalitarian institution with all legally enshrined forms of male dominance eliminated. All restrictions of women's freedom of movement were abolished. A wife was no longer required to reside with her husband or to change her place of residence when he did. Fundamental changes in inheritance and property laws undermined the traditional authority of the husband-father and of the family in general. Women acquired the right to own personal property and to act as the head of the household and, in general, attained equal legal status with men. In addition, abortion was legalized and socialized forms of childcare were developed, with the distinction between quote-unquote legitimate and illegitimate children was abolished. Many of these rights were unheard of in many supposedly advanced and civilized Western societies at that point in time. The socialist attitude towards the family, housework, and childcare was equally progressive. A great deal of attention has been given to the organization of public canteens, kindergartens, young pioneer camps, playgrounds, and creches, those institutions which, as Lenin wrote, facilitate in practice the emancipation of women and are able in practice to reduce the female inequality vis-à-vis men. The Soviet state provides increasing material assistance to mothers. Women receive allowances and paid leave before and after birth of the child, and their post is kept open for them until they return from leave. The USSR had the highest labor force participation rate of women in the world, nearly 87% in the year 1980. The women of the Soviet Union work on an equal footing with men to advance science, culture, and the arts. They occupy an outstanding place in the national education and health services. In a country where there were almost no women engineers, almost no scientists, and an appointment to a teaching post was accompanied by conditions insulting to female dignity, in that country there are now 750,000 women teachers, 100,000 women doctors, and 250,000 women engineers. Women make up 1/2 of the student body in institutions of higher education. The women of the Soviet Union are implementing their political rights in practice. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR has 277 women deputies, while 256,000 women have been elected to rural, urban, regional, and republican organs of state power. Overall, women just enjoyed better and healthier romantic relationships, had more of a basis for personal confidence and autonomy, and, as the title of the aptly named book says, they had better sex under socialism. When women enjoy their own sources of income, and the state guarantees social security in old age, illness, and disability, women have no economic reason to stay in abusive, unfulfilling, or otherwise unhealthy relationships. In countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and East Germany, women's economic independence translated into a culture in which personal relationships could be freed from market influences. Women didn't have to marry for money. When it comes to the LGBTQ community, in the Russian Empire, being homosexual was punishable by law, and it was the Soviet Union that officially decriminalized homosexuality in 1922, decades before any other country in the world. Overall, however, socialist countries of the 20th century were nonetheless still in the initial stages of emancipating the LGBTQ community, theoretically and practically. The cultural level of development of that time showed plenty of homophobic tendencies, which were, to be fair, universal across the entire globe, but were, in the case of socialist countries, maintained through ideological demagoguery, which had very little basis in material reality. Moreover, state atheism and the crackdown on religious communities proved to be one of the most fatal mistakes of 20th century socialism, which, due to the political power of religious institutions, both in pre-socialist regimes and in the active pro-capitalist political opposition, did pose an objective threat to the new socio-economic order and had to be dealt with. The only positive outcome from this overly aggressive and uncompromising attitude was the final separation of church and state, and at least partial elimination of primitive superstitious, patriarchal, and anti-scientific attitudes in the population. When it comes to the various minorities of the USSR, however, Soviet policy has been to encourage the development of national cultures and the preservation of native languages, which was enshrined in Article 36 of the Constitution, that guaranteed equal rights to all races and nationalities. Under the Tsar, there existed a policy of Russification, but now, education and all forms of media are in the native languages. Russian is taught as a second language throughout the country as a lingua franca. Numerous books, magazines, and newspapers are published and are readily available in all the major minority languages. More on the Soviet attitude towards ethnic minorities and nationalities can be found in Martin Terry's book, The Affirmative Action Empire. But, more generally, socialism proved that the coexistence of various peoples and the thriving of multi-ethnic states like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the USSR on an equal and voluntary basis are indeed possible. Why they crumbled with the restoration of capitalism is once again a topic for another time. So, as Kanin concludes, these immense economic and social achievements, in my opinion, permit us to call the 1950s the decade of the Soviet economic miracle, taking into account the social and economic backwardness of pre-revolutionary Russia compared with the advanced countries, and the enormous human and material losses brought about by 3 bitter wars and social upheavals. This result should be considered a unique social and economic achievement. Accordingly, opinion polls throughout the region continue to show that many, if not the majority of people, believe their lives used to be better under socialism. In Romania, considered by some to be the absolute worst example of the Eastern Bloc, 44% of people said their lives were better before 1989. In Albania, which wasn't much better, 42% believe that life was better under socialism. In Bulgaria, 45%, in East Germany, 57%, and in Hungary, 72% of respondents. In Serbia, this figure goes up to a staggering 81%. Moreover, according to polls, the majority of people from former multi-ethnic states like Yugoslavia and the USSR see more harm than good from their breakup. A joke told in many East European languages illustrates this sentiment. In the middle of the night, a woman screams and jumps out of bed, eyes filled with terror. Her startled husband watches her rush into the bathroom and open the medicine cabinet. She then dashes to the kitchen and inspects inside of the refrigerator. Finally, she flings open a window and gazes out onto the street below their apartment. She takes a deep breath and returns to bed. "What's wrong with you?" her husband says. "What happened?" "I had a terrible nightmare," she says. "I dreamed that we had all of the medicine we needed, that our refrigerator was full of food, and that the streets outside were safe and clean." "How is that a nightmare?" The woman shakes her head and shudders. I thought the communists were back in power. Okay, fair enough. But none of this explains why there was such discontent in the population, especially in the 1980s, and why so many people were fleeing towards the West. Well, nobody explains this paradox better than Michael Parenti. By the second or third generation, relatively few are still alive who can favorably contrast their lives under socialism with the great hardships and injustices of pre-revolutionary days. People took for granted what they had in the way of human services and entitlements, while hungering for the consumer goods dangling in their imaginations. It seems that communism created a dialectical dynamic that undermined itself. It took semi-feudal, devastated, underdeveloped countries and successfully industrialized them, bringing a better life for most. But this very process of modernization and uplift also created expectations that could not be fulfilled. Many expected to keep all of the securities of socialism overlaid with capitalist consumerism. Since none of them ever actually lived under capitalism and didn't get to experience its numerous ugly sides firsthand, they romanticized the idea of capitalism and its consumer culture to an absurd extent. They didn't appear to understand that for one country to be rich, as was the US for example, another 10 had to be dirt poor. The expectation that the restoration of capitalism in the 90s would satisfy their fantasies was based on a misunderstanding of this basic fact, of the very nature of global imperialism. They wanted it all, and when the deed was done, were left with almost nothing. And in case you're interested in learning more about the decommunization of Eastern Europe and the horrific consequences thereof, I do have a video on that. And in the meantime, I feel like there's one simple tenet of self-improvement that can serve also as a good lesson for revolutionary upheavals that might come in the future, and might help us be more grateful for the things we achieve. Don't compare yourself to others, but to who you were yesterday. Thank you for watching, and thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check out their special offer with the link in the description and get 4 months of free access to all of Surfshark's features. Have fun and stay tuned.